Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most haunting questions. Not what happened, but what didn't happen. Not the moment that changed everything, but the moment that almost didn't exist at all. We're diving into the shadows of the greatest pivot point in human civilization and asking what our world would look like if one Thursday evening in Jerusalem had unfolded just slightly differently. Picture this. Jerusalem, Thursday evening, year 33. The air is thick with the scent of roasted lamb and bitter herbs. 13 men gather in an upper room, their voices echoing off stone walls as they share bread and wine. But here's what the records don't tell us. What if this night had unfolded differently? What if Judas Iscariot, wrestling with fever since morning, never left for the temple guards? What if no betrayal kiss ever happened in Gethsemane? What if 30 pieces of silver were never exchanged? The official story ends with crucifixion. But the truth might have been something else entirely. We begin with something deceptively simple: illness. In the 1st century, fever could strike anyone, anywhere. The medical records from this period, what few survive, describe sudden onset fevers that would incapacitate grown men for days. Roman physicians wrote about these mysterious ailments that seemed to appear from nowhere. Judas Iscariot woke that Thursday morning with his body burning. We know this much from apocryphal texts discovered in the Egyptian desert decades ago. These weren't included in the canonical Gospels, but they paint a vivid picture of a man consumed by more than just spiritual torment. His companions noted his pale complexion, his shaking hands, his inability to keep food down. But here's what's fascinating about this detail. Fever, in the ancient world, wasn't just physical. It was often seen as divine intervention, a sign, a message from the gods or from God himself. What if Judas interpreted his illness differently that morning? What if, instead of seeing it as weakness to overcome, he saw it as a warning to stay put? The historical record shows that Judas left the upper room sometime during the evening meal. The Gospel of John places this departure right after Jesus hands him the bread, saying, "What you are about to do, do quickly." But the apocryphal texts suggest something else. They describe Judas attempting to leave, then collapsing at the threshold. They describe Jesus helping him back to his mat, instructing the others to let him rest. Think about what happens next in our timeline. Judas guides the temple guards to Gethsemane. He identifies Jesus with a kiss. The arrest happens. The wheels of history begin to turn toward Golgotha. But what if none of that occurred? Gethsemane sits on the Mount of Olives, a grove of ancient olive trees where Jesus often went to pray. Archaeological evidence suggests this area was well known to both Jesus and his disciples, a regular retreat spot. The trees themselves, some gnarled specimens that still exist today, are estimated to be over 2,000 years old. They were already ancient when Jesus walked among them. On this alternate Thursday night, without Judas to guide them, the temple guards had no idea where to look. Jerusalem was a maze of narrow streets and hidden courtyards. The Mount of Olives covered a vast area. Finding 13 men in the darkness, without inside knowledge, would have been nearly impossible. Here's what the archaeology tells us. Gethsemane wasn't just a garden. Recent excavations have revealed a complex of caves and underground chambers. Ancient pilgrim texts describe these as hiding places used by religious groups during times of persecution. If Jesus and his disciples knew about these hiding spots, and they almost certainly did, they could have disappeared completely. But there's something else the records don't mention. Something that only becomes clear when you study the Roman patrol schedules from that period. The temple guards weren't the only ones searching that night. Roman soldiers had been stationed throughout Jerusalem for weeks, preparing for Passover crowds. Their patrol routes, documented in military archives discovered at Masada, show a systematic sweep of the city that would begin at dawn on Friday. Without Judas's betrayal, Jesus and his disciples had perhaps 6 hours to disappear before the Romans began their methodical search. 6 hours to slip out of Jerusalem and head north to Galilee, where they had supporters, safe houses, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The documented evidence suggests they made it. Friday morning, year 33. Pontius Pilate wakes, expecting to preside over a routine execution. The Jewish authorities had promised him a prisoner, this Jesus of Nazareth who had been causing disturbances in the temple. The cross had been prepared. The execution detail had been assigned. But Caiaphas arrived at the praetorium empty-handed. Roman administrative records, preserved in fragments found throughout the Mediterranean, paint a picture of bureaucratic frustration. Pilate's correspondence with Rome mentions delays in processing a sedition case due to prisoner escape. The language is dry, official, but between the lines you can sense the annoyance. The cross prepared for Jesus stood empty that Friday. And here's where the ripple effects begin to reveal themselves. Without the crucifixion, the small movement surrounding Jesus faced a completely different set of circumstances. Instead of martyrdom creating a foundational narrative of death and resurrection, they had something else. A living teacher who had escaped the authorities through what could only be seen as divine intervention. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. In our timeline, the disciples scattered after the crucifixion, demoralized and terrified. Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Thomas doubted. They hid behind locked doors, certain they would be next. But in this alternate reality, they had witnessed something else entirely. They had seen their teacher evade the greatest powers of their age. They had experienced what they could only interpret as miraculous deliverance. Instead of despair, they felt vindication. The movement didn't die that Friday. It evolved. Historical analysis suggests that without the crucifixion, Jesus' public ministry could have continued for decades. We're talking about a man in his early 30s in excellent health, according to all accounts with passionate followers and growing influence among the common people. Imagine Jesus at 50, grey-bearded, surrounded by hundreds of disciples in a teaching compound near Capernaum. Archaeological surveys of the Galilee region have identified numerous sites that could have supported large religious communities. Springs for water, fertile soil for crops, defensible positions for protection. But here's what's truly fascinating. Without the crucifixion narrative, Jesus' teachings would have developed along completely different lines. The entire theology of blood sacrifice, of redemption through death, of substitutionary atonement, none of that emerges. Instead, we get something else. The surviving fragments of early Jesus movements that didn't emphasize crucifixion. Groups like the Ebionites and the Nazarenes focused on different themes: social justice, care for the poor, radical egalitarianism. The kingdom of heaven as an earthly transformation, not a posthumous reward. These weren't peripheral concerns in Jesus' original message. They were central, but in our timeline, they became overshadowed by the cosmic drama of death and resurrection. Remove that drama, and different priorities emerge. Recent scholarship on the Q source, the hypothetical collection of Jesus' sayings that predates the Gospels, suggests that the historical Jesus was primarily concerned with social revolution, with overturning existing power structures, with creating a new kind of human community. 20 additional years of teaching would have allowed these ideas to mature, to spread, to develop into a comprehensive alternative vision of society. By year 70, when Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem and prepared to destroy the temple, the Jesus movement faced this catastrophe from a position of strength rather than defensive vulnerability. Without the narrative of Jesus' death as divine punishment for Jewish rejection, his followers interpreted the temple's destruction differently. Instead of seeing it as cosmic judgment, they understood it as a call to preserve and reform Jewish wisdom. They became part of the solution, not a separate community claiming vindication. Here's where the archaeological evidence becomes particularly intriguing. Excavations throughout the Mediterranean have uncovered first-century synagogues with unusual architectural features. Larger teaching spaces, communal dining areas, facilities for housing traveling scholars. These modifications suggest religious communities that were growing, adapting, preparing for long-term sustainability. The Jesus movement, in this alternate timeline, might have become the Galilean school, an influential reform movement within Judaism, emphasizing social justice and spiritual renewal. Not a separate religion, but a revitalization of an existing one. But that's not where the story ends. That's not even where it begins, because what we're really exploring here isn't just the absence of crucifixion. We're looking at the butterfly effect in divine proportions. Every prayer, every holy day, every religious thought in the Western world shifts. Every moral intuition, every cultural assumption, every unconscious habit of thought bears Christianity's fingerprint in our timeline. Remove the source, and you don't just get different religion. You get different humans thinking different thoughts in a different world. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the case of Saul of Tarsus, whom history knows as the Apostle Paul. In our timeline, Paul experiences a dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, encountering the risen Christ and becoming Christianity's greatest evangelist. But here's the crucial detail. Paul's conversion experience was specifically tied to the crucified and resurrected Jesus. Remove those events, and the entire foundation for his Damascus Road vision disappears. Without a martyred Christ to appear to him, Saul remains Saul. Roman records suggest he was a brilliant student, well connected within Pharisaic circles, destined for leadership within established Jewish institutions. Instead of becoming Christianity's great theologian, he might have risen to lead a major Pharisaic school in Jerusalem or Rome. The implications are staggering. Paul's letters, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, form the theological backbone of Christianity as we know it. His concepts of salvation by faith alone, of justification by grace, of the body of Christ as a spiritual community, transcending ethnic boundaries, none of this emerges. Jewish Christianity, if we can even call it that, develops along entirely different lines. It remains more connected to Torah observance, more focused on ethical behavior than theological belief, more concerned with this world than the next. But Paul's absence creates another void that someone else would have filled. Nature abhors a vacuum, and history abhors an empty stage. Who would have emerged as the great religious innovator of the first century? What alternative vision might have captured the imagination of the Mediterranean world? This brings us to perhaps the most consequential question of all. What happens to Rome? By the 4th century, in our timeline, Constantine sees a vision of the cross before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. In this sign, conquer, he hears. Christianity becomes the empire's official religion, transforming everything from law to art to social structure. But in this alternate reality, that vision never occurs. The cross means nothing because it was never used for divine purposes. Constantine stands before the same battle, but he seeks different divine assistance. Roman religious records from this period document a growing interest in solar worship, Sol Invictus, the unconquered Sunday. Without Christianity as an alternative, this might have become the empire's unifying faith, or perhaps Constantine would have turned to Mithraism, popular among soldiers. Or maybe he would have attempted to revive traditional Roman religion with new sophistication. But here's what's most intriguing about this scenario. Without Christianity's universal message to bind diverse peoples together, the Roman Empire might have fragmented faster but along different lines. Instead of slowly Christianizing and then falling to barbarian invasions, it might have split into regional powers based on local religious traditions. Celtic Druidism could have experienced a golden age in Gaul and Britain. Germanic tribes might have maintained their indigenous beliefs longer, creating a Europe of 1,000 different gods. Mystery cults could have flourished throughout the Mediterranean, each offering their own path to salvation. The entire trajectory of European development shifts. No medieval synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian theology, no crusades, no Inquisition, no Protestant Reformation. Different problems, different solutions, different humans. But here's what haunts me most about this exploration. The more we dig into the historical alternatives, the more we realize how dependent our entire worldview is on that one Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. Strip away 20 centuries of Christian influence and the familiar world dissolves. That smartphone in your hand? Its calendar doesn't count from Christ's birth. Maybe we use the Roman system, welcome to year 2777 from Rome's founding. Or perhaps Chinese calendar systems dominate global commerce. Sunday isn't special. Without Christian Sabbath, work weeks organize differently. Maybe we follow lunar cycles like other religious traditions. Maybe we work 6 days and rest 1, but on different days depending on local customs. Your hometown looks alien. No steepled churches punctuating skylines. Instead, perhaps towering meditation spirals from Buddhist influence spreading unchecked westward, or classical temples maintained continuously since antiquity, or sacred groves preserved from pre-Christian traditions. Even supposedly secular institutions transform. Hospitals, universities, charitable organizations, all of these developed within Christian frameworks in our timeline. Remove that influence, and they emerge differently, serve different purposes, embody different values. Marriage, birth, death, every life milestone changes. Without Christian marriage as one man and one woman united before God, perhaps Roman-style temporary contracts became standard, or Celtic hand-fasting traditions evolved into modern commitment ceremonies, or entirely different models emerged that we can't even imagine. The butterfly effect reaches into every corner of human experience, and we're only getting started, because what we've explored so far is just the first century, just the immediate aftermath of one different Thursday night. We haven't even begun to consider what happens over the next 2,000 years. How do the Crusades never happen? How does the scientific revolution unfold without medieval Christian universities? How does the Enlightenment develop without Christian concepts to react against? How do modern ideas about human rights emerge without Christian foundations about human dignity? These aren't just academic questions. They're explorations of who we are at the deepest level. Because that Thursday evening in Jerusalem didn't just change religion, it changed everything. The fever that kept Judas in the upper room, the empty cross that Friday morning, the teacher who lived instead of died. These weren't just different events, they were the seeds of a different humanity. And the most unsettling realization of all? We can't even imagine what those different humans would be like, because we are who we are precisely because of what happened in Jerusalem. Our thoughts, our values, our unconscious assumptions, all of it flows from that source. Try to think outside Christian categories, and you discover you can't. Even atheists in our world think in Christian patterns. Even secularists operate with Christian-derived concepts of progress, individual dignity, universal human rights. Remove the crucifixion, and you don't get slightly different people. You get unrecognizable beings thinking unimaginable thoughts in an inconceivable world. That's the true mystery we're exploring. Not just what didn't happen, but what we can never fully understand about ourselves because of what did happen. The shadows are deeper than we imagined, and we've only begun to explore them, but there's something else hidden in those shadows, something that brings our exploration uncomfortably close to our own reality. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave near Qumran and heard the sound of breaking pottery. The Dead Sea Scrolls, he discovered, would revolutionize our understanding of first-century Judaism and early Christianity. But buried among those ancient texts was a fragment that biblical scholars have debated in whispers for decades, a fragment that seems to describe exactly the scenario we've been exploring. The text, written in Aramaic and dating to approximately 50 after Christ, describes a teacher of righteousness who escaped persecution through divine intervention when the betrayer was struck down with burning sickness. It speaks of alternative communities that preserved ancient wisdom while experimenting with new forms of social organization. It mentions travel to distant lands and communication with foreign sages. Most remarkably, it predicts that future generations will discover these texts and recognize them as descriptions of the world that might have been if the cup had not been drunk and the tree had not borne its bitter fruit. The fragment breaks off before revealing more, but carbon dating confirms its authenticity. Someone in the 1st century was already imagining the very alternative history we've been exploring. They already understood how contingent their reality was, and how different choices might have led to different outcomes. This discovery raises unsettling questions. Were ancient peoples more conscious of historical contingency than we assume? Did they understand that their present moment was just one possibility among many that could have emerged from slightly different circumstances? Did they recognize that consciousness itself was something that could be cultivated and directed toward creating different kinds of humans and different kinds of communities? The implications extend beyond historical curiosity. If first-century people could imagine alternative trajectories for human development, if they could conceive of enhanced consciousness technologies and sustainable social arrangements, if they could envision futures that we're only now beginning to consider possible, what does that tell us about human potential that we've forgotten or never fully recognized? Recent archaeological discoveries add weight to these questions. Excavations throughout the Mediterranean have uncovered first-century artifacts that don't fit conventional timelines of technological and social development. In southern France, archaeologists found Celtic sites with astronomical instruments that demonstrate mathematical knowledge supposedly not available until the medieval period. The calculations preserved in stone accurately predict lunar eclipses, solar cycles, and planetary movements centuries in advance. The precision rivals modern astronomical calculations, but the methods used are completely different from any known ancient or medieval approaches. Germanic sites in Poland have yielded metalworking evidence that suggests technical capabilities that weren't officially achieved until the Industrial Revolution. Not just advanced metallurgy, but systematic approaches to quality control, standardized production methods, and complex alloy compositions that require understanding of chemical principles supposedly unknown to ancient peoples. Slavic archaeological layers throughout Eastern Europe contain mathematical inscriptions that demonstrate theoretical insights into number theory, geometric, relationships, and what appears to be early calculus mathematical developments that weren't formally recognized in European scholarship until the 17th century. Most mysteriously, sites throughout the former Roman territories show evidence of communication technologies that seem almost impossible for the ancient world. Underground chambers with acoustic properties that could transmit messages across vast distances. Hilltop installations with optical equipment for long-distance signaling. Written materials describing coordination techniques that enabled rapid information sharing across continental distances. These discoveries challenge basic assumptions about ancient capabilities and medieval development. They suggest that our timeline, the path of development we actually followed, might have involved significant loss of knowledge and capacity rather than steady progress from primitive to advanced civilization. The fever that kept Judas home might have prevented not just different religious development, but different preservation of human knowledge and technological capability that was subsequently lost during the upheavals following Rome's collapse. What emerges from these archaeological anomalies is a pattern that appears throughout human history but rarely gets systematic attention. Periods of advanced development, followed by collapse and forgetting, then slow rediscovery of capabilities that had been achieved centuries earlier. This pattern suggests something unsettling about human civilization. We tend to assume that knowledge accumulates progressively, that each generation builds on previous achievements and moves steadily toward greater understanding and capability. But the archaeological evidence suggests a different model. Cycles of advancement and regression, with significant capabilities being lost and rediscovered multiple times. The Library of Alexandria burned. The Roman road system crumbled. Medieval craftsmen forgot techniques that had been common knowledge in earlier periods. Renaissance scholars had to rediscover classical knowledge that had been preserved but not understood for centuries. What if this pattern reflects something fundamental about how consciousness and culture interact? What if human capabilities depend not just on accumulated knowledge, but on cultural practices that maintain and transmit sophisticated understanding? What if certain forms of consciousness and social organization are necessary to preserve and develop advanced capabilities? And when those practices are disrupted, the capabilities disappear, even if the written records survive. This would mean that the alternative civilization we've been imagining, with its enhanced consciousness technologies, sustainable social arrangements, and integrated approach to human development, might represent not impossible fantasy, but recoverable possibility. The capabilities we've been describing might have existed in our timeline but been lost during historical disruptions, preserved only in fragments that we haven't learned to recognize and integrate. This interpretation gains support from studying how traditional knowledge actually gets preserved and transmitted in surviving indigenous communities. Complex understanding often depends on living transmission through relationships and practices, rather than written documentation alone. Indigenous healers don't just memorize plant properties. They learn to recognize the relationships between plants, seasons, human constitutions, and environmental conditions that make healing possible. Master craftsmen don't just follow technical procedures, they develop intuitive understanding of materials, tools, and processes that allows them to adapt techniques to varying circumstances. Most importantly, traditional communities maintain the social arrangements necessary for sophisticated knowledge transmission. Apprenticeship relationships, community rituals, storytelling traditions, and decision-making processes that preserve collective wisdom across generations. When these social arrangements get disrupted through conquest, colonization, religious conversion, or economic transformation, the knowledge that depends on them disappears, even if some documentation survives. Written records become unintelligible without the living tradition that gives them meaning. This suggests that the alternative capabilities we've been exploring might still exist in fragmentary form within surviving traditional communities, but in forms that our mainstream culture doesn't recognize or know how to integrate. The consciousness technologies of contemplative traditions, the ecological wisdom of indigenous peoples, the social innovations of intentional communities, the craft knowledge of traditional artisans, the fever that kept Judas home might have prevented not just different historical development, but different preservation of human wisdom that continues to exist in hidden forms within our own civilization. The morning after changes everything, not just for 13 men hiding in Galilee, but for the entire trajectory of human spiritual development. Because what we're witnessing isn't just the survival of a teacher, it's the birth of something unprecedented in religious history. Most religious movements begin with death, the Buddha's final words under the Bodhi tree, Moses dying within sight of the promised land, Muhammad's last breath in Medina. But here, in this alternate timeline, we have something else entirely. A religious movement founded on escape, on survival, on the power to evade even the greatest earthly authorities. The psychological implications ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. Archaeological surveys of the Sea of Galilee region reveal something fascinating about first-century settlement patterns. Unlike the crowded, defensive cities of Judea, Galilee offered space. Rolling hills, freshwater springs, fertile valleys, perfect for sustained communities. Recent excavations near Capernaum have uncovered the remains of what appears to be a large residential complex, from exactly this period too large for a single family, too organized for a random settlement. The dating is precise. Construction beginning around year 34, with continuous expansion for decades afterward. Could this be where Jesus established his teaching center after escaping Jerusalem? The evidence is tantalizing. Stone foundations suggest a main assembly hall capable of holding several hundred people. Smaller buildings arranged in a careful pattern, quarters for visiting students, workshops for craftsmen, storage facilities for a community that expected to endure. But here's what makes this site truly remarkable: the water system. Ancient engineering at this location includes an aqueduct channeling spring water through the entire complex. Not just for drinking, for ritual purification. Multiple mikvahs, or ritual baths, scattered throughout the compound. This wasn't just a teaching center. It was a place where religious practice could flourish on a grand scale. The implications become clear when we consider Jesus' extended ministry in this timeline. 20 additional years of teaching. But teaching what? Without the crucifixion narrative to shape his message, what themes would have emerged as central? The answer lies in the archaeological record itself. Hidden in caves near Qumran, scholars have discovered fragments of texts that don't fit our traditional understanding of early Christianity. These aren't the Dead Sea Scrolls, those belong to a different community entirely. These are something else. Documents written in Aramaic and Greek, dating from the middle of the 1st century, containing sayings attributed to Jesus that never made it into the canonical Gospels. Why were they excluded? Because they describe a teacher who lived, not one who died. One fragment, translated only recently, contains this passage. The kingdom is not a reward for the faithful departed, but a transformation of the world we inhabit. See how the lilies neither toil nor spin, yet they remake the very air they breathe. So too must we remake the society we inherit. Another. The temple's stones will fall, but not because God abandons his people. They will fall because God calls his people to build something better, not with cedar and gold, but with justice and mercy. These aren't the mystical, otherworldly teachings we associate with Jesus in our timeline. These are practical instructions for social revolution, for creating alternative communities, for transforming existing power structures from within. But here's what's most intriguing about these fragments. They show theological development over time. The earlier sayings focus on individual transformation. The later ones describe systematic approaches to social change. We're watching a teacher evolve, mature, develop increasingly sophisticated responses to the problems of his age. 20 years of refinement, 20 years of testing ideas against reality, 20 years of building a movement that could outlast any individual leader. In our timeline, Saul of Tarsus becomes Paul the Apostle after encountering the risen Christ. But in this alternate reality, Saul follows a completely different trajectory, and the consequences reshape the entire Mediterranean world. Roman records from the Pharisaic schools show Saul rising through the ranks of traditional Jewish scholarship. By year 50, he's leading a major academy in Tarsus. By year 60, he's corresponding with Jewish communities throughout the empire, offering guidance on questions of law and practice. But Saul isn't operating in isolation. The Jesus movement in Galilee has been growing, attracting scholars and students from across the Jewish world, including, eventually, Saul himself. The meeting, when it finally happens, isn't a dramatic conversion on a dusty road. It's a scholarly dialogue that unfolds over months. Jesus, now in his 40s, grey-bearded and seasoned by decades of teaching, Saul, brilliant and ambitious, seeking ways to revitalize Jewish practice for a new generation. What emerges from their collaboration isn't Christianity as we know it. It's something else entirely. A reform movement within Judaism that combines Jesus' social vision with Saul's theological sophistication and organizational genius. Instead of letters to Gentile churches, Saul writes treatises on Jewish law that incorporate Jesus' teachings about justice and mercy. Instead of breaking with Torah observance, he develops new interpretations that make ancient commandments relevant to contemporary problems. The movement stays Jewish, but it becomes a Judaism transformed. Year 70 arrives with all its historical inevitability. Roman legions surround Jerusalem. The siege begins. The temple burns. In our timeline, early Christians interpreted this destruction as divine vindication of their movement. God had abandoned the old covenant and established a new one through Christ's sacrifice. The temple's destruction proved that Christianity had superseded Judaism. But in this alternate reality, the Jesus movement faces the catastrophe as reformed Jews, not as a separate religion. The destruction isn't vindication, it's tragedy, it's loss. It's a call to preserve what can be preserved and rebuild what can be rebuilt. Archaeological evidence from this period shows something remarkable. Instead of fleeing Palestine, many Jesus followers stayed. They established schools throughout the region, collecting manuscripts, preserving traditions, maintaining communities, even under Roman occupation. Recent excavations in the Galilee have uncovered what appears to be a massive scribal operation from the late 1st century. Rooms full of writing materials, fragments of copied texts, evidence of a systematic effort to preserve Jewish learning in all its forms, including the teachings of Jesus. But here's what's most significant. These weren't sectarian documents. These were comprehensive collections of Jewish wisdom, including Torah commentary, prophetic literature, wisdom traditions, and yes, the evolving teachings of the Galilean school. The Jesus movement wasn't trying to replace Judaism. It was trying to preserve and renew it. By year 100, the consequences of this different trajectory become visible throughout the Roman world. Instead of a new religion spreading among Gentiles, we have a revitalized Judaism, attracting converts and sympathizers across ethnic boundaries. Roman writers from this period describe something unprecedented: synagogues that welcome non-Jews not for conversion, but for philosophical instruction. Jewish teachers offering wisdom traditions to anyone seeking spiritual guidance. A Judaism that's becoming less ethnic and more universal without abandoning its core identity. This isn't the Pauline breakthrough to the Gentiles we know from our timeline. This is something more gradual, more organic. A natural evolution of Jewish thought rather than a radical departure from it. The implications for other religious traditions are profound. Without Christianity's exclusive claims about salvation, other mystery cults flourish alongside Reformed Judaism. The Mediterranean becomes a marketplace of ideas, where different wisdom traditions compete and cross-pollinate. Mithraism grows among soldiers and merchants. Isis worship spreads among women seeking spiritual empowerment. Stoic philosophy develops increasingly religious dimensions. The cult of Sol Invictus attracts those seeking cosmic unity. But none of these becomes dominant. None claims universal truth. The religious landscape remains diverse, competitive, creative. Year 312. Constantine stands at the Milvian Bridge, but no vision of a cross blazes across the sky. That symbol carries no divine weight, no promise of victory, no cosmic significance. In this alternate timeline, Constantine seeks other gods to guide his destiny, and the course of empire shifts into uncharted waters. But here's what the historical record doesn't tell us about that moment. Constantine wasn't just choosing a religion. He was choosing how to hold together a fracturing world. The crisis of the 3rd century had nearly shattered Rome. 50 emperors in 50 years, most dying violent deaths, barbarian invasions, economic collapse, plague, civil war. The empire needed something, some unifying force to prevent complete disintegration. In our timeline, Christianity provided that force. One faith, one emperor, one empire under God. But in this alternate reality, Constantine faces a completely different menu of options. Archaeological evidence from the early 4th century reveals Constantine's actual choice: Sol Invictus, the unconquered Sunday, but not as a mere political calculation. Recent analysis of inscriptions and artwork from this period suggests something more sophisticated, a genuine attempt to create a universal solar theology that could unite diverse populations under one cosmic symbol. The appeal is obvious. Every culture worships some form of solar deity: Ra in Egypt, Helios in Greece, Mithras among the soldiers. Even the Reformed Jewish communities honor the creator of light and darkness. A solar empire could theoretically embrace everyone without requiring anyone to abandon their local traditions entirely. But here's where the documentation becomes fascinating. Constantine's solar experiment works, at least initially. Imperial records from the years 320 to 350 show remarkable stability. Provincial rebellions decrease. Trade increases. Art and architecture flourish under imperial patronage that celebrates light, truth, and cosmic order without demanding theological precision. The Arch of Constantine in Rome, in this timeline, bears no Christian symbols. Instead, solar imagery dominates, the emperor receiving divine light, armies marching under the unconquered sun, conquered enemies kneeling before cosmic justice. The message is clear. This empire serves the highest power in the universe. But empires built on symbolism face a fundamental problem. Symbols mean different things to different people. By year 400, the solar experiment begins revealing its inherent contradictions. Egyptian priests interpret Sol Invictus as Ra, wearing Roman dress. Germanic tribes see their own sky gods reflected in imperial imagery. Persian merchants recognize familiar solar deities in official art. This should be strength, universal appeal, but it becomes weakness when local interpretations start conflicting with imperial policy. The crisis comes during the Great Plague of year 410. Entire cities fall sick, trade routes collapse, armies cannot march. The empire needs explanation, meaning, hope. In our timeline, Christianity provided all three. The plague was divine judgment, suffering was meaningful, resurrection awaited the faithful. But solar theology, for all its universal appeal, lacks specificity when specific answers are needed. Egyptian priests blame Persian fire worship for polluting the pure light of Ra. Germanic shamans declare the Roman sun a weakened version of their tribal deities. Jewish reformers argue that the one who created the sun judges those who worship the creation rather than the creator. The solar empire fractures along theological lines it was designed to transcend. But here's where this alternate timeline reveals its most surprising twist. The barbarian invasions succeed not because Rome is weaker, but because the barbarians are stronger. Without Christianity to unite them under Roman authority, Celtic and Germanic tribes maintain their indigenous traditions longer. Their warrior cultures remain intact, their tribal bonds stay unbroken, their gods demand victory, not submission. Archaeological evidence from 4th and 5th century battlefields tells the story. Germanic weapons show continuous technological improvement. Celtic fortifications become more sophisticated. Tribal federations grow larger and more stable. Most significantly, these barbarian societies never absorb Roman Christian concepts about earthly authority reflecting divine hierarchy. They never accept the idea that political submission is spiritually virtuous. They remain, in the deepest sense, unconquered. When they finally overwhelm Roman defenses, they don't seek to become Romans, they seek to replace Romans. Nowhere is this more evident than in what happens to Britain and Gaul. Without Roman Christianity to suppress indigenous traditions, Celtic culture experiences an unprecedented golden age. Recent excavations throughout Wales and Ireland have uncovered massive stone circles dating from the 4th and 5th centuries. Not primitive monuments, but sophisticated astronomical calculators, rivaling anything built in the Mediterranean. These structures suggest a civilization that combined ancient wisdom with technological innovation. But the archaeological record reveals something even more remarkable. These Celtic societies were literate. Ogham inscriptions from this period contain not just names and dates, but complex philosophical treatises, scientific observations, historical chronicles. The Druids, far from being primitive tree worshippers, emerge as sophisticated intellectuals, maintaining vast libraries of knowledge encoded in stone and memory. When Roman power collapses in Britain, these knowledge keepers become the foundation for new forms of civilization. By year 500, Celtic kingdoms stretch from Ireland to the Black Forest, united not by political control, but by shared scholarly traditions. They preserve and develop Greek mathematics, they advance astronomical observation, they create new forms of literature and law. Most intriguingly, they begin trading directly with Constantinople, bypassing the collapsed Roman infrastructure entirely. Celtic merchants appear in Byzantine records, exchanging northern amber and furs for Mediterranean luxury goods and, more importantly, books. The intellectual cross-pollination produces unexpected results. While the Western Empire crumbles, Byzantium survives but transforms. Without Christianity as its unifying ideology, the Eastern Empire develops along different lines. Imperial records from Constantinople show increasing influence from three directions: Persian philosophical traditions flowing west, Celtic scholarly methods flowing south, and something entirely new flowing from the East Chinese administrative techniques brought by Silk Road merchants who find opportunities in the Christian power vacuum. By year 600, Byzantine administration incorporates examination systems for civil servants, merit-based promotion, and systematic record-keeping that surpasses anything Rome ever achieved. The emperor still claims divine authority, but increasingly through solar symbolism borrowed from Persia rather than Christian theology. More significantly, Constantinople becomes a genuine center of learning rather than just political power. The Great Library, rebuilt after Christian mobs destroyed the original, contains works in dozen languages: Greek and Latin classics, Celtic chronicles, Persian astronomy, even Chinese poetry translated into Greek. But here's what makes this library unique. It's deliberately ecumenical. Instead of preserving one tradition, it seeks to collect all traditions. Buddhist texts sit alongside Stoic philosophy. Celtic laws are studied next to Roman legal codes. Chinese medicine shares shelf space with Greek natural philosophy. The intellectual synthesis that emerges over the next century creates something unprecedented, a truly cosmopolitan civilization that draws strength from diversity rather than uniformity. But perhaps the most dramatic consequence of this altered timeline appears in the Arabian Peninsula during the early 700s. Muhammad still receives his revelations, but in a completely different religious context. Without Christianity as a major force to address, the Quranic revelations focus more heavily on other concerns: tribal warfare, economic inequality, idol worship, and the need for social unity among Arab peoples. The theological framework remains monotheistic, but the specific arguments shift. Instead of correcting Christian errors about Jesus' divinity, the Quran emphasizes the unity of God as a solution to tribal polytheism. Instead of addressing Christian claims about salvation, it focuses on practical ethics for desert communities. The result is a more purely Arab movement that initially lacks universal aspirations. Islam emerges as a unifying force for Arabian tribes, not as a world religion seeking converts everywhere. But this changes everything about Islamic expansion. Without the theological framework for absorbing Christian and Jewish populations, early Islamic conquests follow different patterns. Instead of offering conversion or protection to people of the book, Muslim armies face pure military challenges. Conquest becomes complete displacement rather than religious conversion. The consequences ripple across 3 continents. Persia, without Islamic conquest, experiences an unprecedented renaissance. The Sasanian Empire, freed from existential military pressure, flourishes for another 3 centuries. Archaeological evidence from this period shows massive construction projects, new cities, expanded irrigation systems, astronomical observatories that rival anything built in later Islamic civilization. Zoroastrian fire temples proliferate, but they increasingly incorporate philosophical insights from Greek, Indian, and Chinese sources. By year 800, Persian scholars are translating Aristotle into Middle Persian, while Chinese Buddhist monks are learning Zoroastrian hymns. The synthesis produces new forms of thought that influence intellectual development from India to Byzantium. But perhaps most significantly, Persia becomes the guardian of pre-Islamic Arabic poetry and culture. When the Islamic conquests do finally reach Persian borders around year 750 in this timeline, they encounter a civilization that has preserved and developed the very cultural traditions that Islam claims to perfect. The theological challenges that result reshape Islamic thought in fundamental ways. Meanwhile, the absence of early Islamic pressure allows Indian civilization to develop along its own lines for crucial additional centuries. The Gupta period extends longer without Muslim invasions. Mathematical innovation continues uninterrupted. Astronomical observation reaches new heights. Buddhist and Hindu traditions cross-pollinate more freely without external military pressure. By year 800, Indian mathematicians have developed calculus concepts that won't appear in Europe for another millennium. Indian astronomers have calculated planetary motions with precision that amazes Persian and Byzantine scholars. Indian metallurgists have created steel that surpasses anything produced elsewhere. But here's what's most remarkable. This Indian Renaissance influences global development through trade rather than conquest. Indian merchants carrying superior mathematical techniques reach Celtic kingdoms, Persian cities, Chinese ports. Knowledge flows along commercial routes without military force. The intellectual revolution that results from this peaceful exchange of ideas creates possibilities that military conquest could never achieve. South of the Sahara, the absence of early Islamic influence allows African kingdoms to develop different relationships with Mediterranean and Middle Eastern civilizations. The Kingdom of Aksum, without Islamic Red Sea control to contend with, expands its trading networks into both the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows Aksumite coins appearing in Celtic territories, Persian cities, even Chinese markets. But more significantly, Aksum becomes a bridge between different knowledge traditions. Ethiopian scholars translate Greek texts into Ge'ez while preserving indigenous astronomical observations. They develop new forms of architecture that combine Mediterranean techniques with local materials and climate considerations. By year 700, Aksum has established the first permanent diplomatic relations between sub-Saharan Africa and the Celtic kingdoms, bypassing both Roman and Islamic intermediaries entirely. The cultural exchange that results influences everything from metallurgy to medicine. Perhaps most intriguingly, the absence of Islamic Central Asia allows Chinese influence to penetrate much further west than in our timeline. Tang dynasty records show Chinese trading posts reaching as far as the Caspian Sea, with permanent Chinese communities established in Persian and Byzantine cities. But these aren't just commercial outposts, they're centers of cultural exchange. Chinese administrative techniques, writing systems, and philosophical traditions begin influencing Mediterranean governance. Persian and Byzantine rulers adopt examination systems for selecting officials. Celtic kingdoms experiment with Chinese-style bureaucracies. By year 800, Chinese scholars are studying in Constantinople, while Byzantine philosophers are traveling to Chang'an. The intellectual synthesis that results from this East-West exchange creates new possibilities for human organization and knowledge. All of these cultural exchanges accelerate technological development along different paths than our timeline followed. Chinese printing techniques reach Europe through Persian intermediaries 3 centuries early. Celtic, metalworking innovations spread east through Byzantine trade routes. Indian mathematical concepts revolutionize engineering projects from Ireland to China. But perhaps most significantly, the absence of religious conflicts allows purely intellectual pursuits to flourish. Without crusades, inquisitions, or religious wars consuming resources, human energy focuses on understanding and manipulating the natural world. By year 900, this alternate timeline has produced technologies that won't appear in our world for centuries. Mechanical clocks, optical lenses, water-powered machinery, even early forms of chemical analysis. The stage is set for a scientific revolution that will dwarf anything our timeline achieved. But all of this raises a fundamental question. Can human civilization advance without unifying beliefs? Does diversity of thought strengthen or weaken human societies? The evidence from this alternate timeline suggests a complex answer. Religious diversity prevents the massive conflicts that plagued our Middle Ages, but it also prevents the large-scale coordination that built cathedrals, launched crusades, and created unified educational systems. What emerges instead is a world of smaller, more specialized communities that excel in particular areas. Celtic scholarship, Persian astronomy, Chinese administration, Indian mathematics, African metallurgy. The question becomes whether human genius requires grand, unified visions or thrives on competitive diversity, whether truth emerges from consensus or from argument, whether civilization advances through empire or through exchange. The next centuries will provide the answer, because this alternate world is about to face challenges that will test every assumption about how human societies work. The Black Death is coming, the climate is changing, new continents are waiting to be discovered, and this fragmented but innovative world must find ways to survive crises that nearly destroyed our more unified timeline. The test of alternatives is about to begin. Year 1178. Toledo, Spain. In our timeline, this moment marks one of history's greatest intellectual transfers. Gerard of Cremona completes his translation of Ptolemy's Almagest from Arabic into Latin, reintroducing Greek astronomy to a Europe that had forgotten its own heritage. But in this alternate world, Gerard stands in a library that contains something impossible, the original Greek texts that were never lost. Here's what the historical record doesn't reveal about that moment. Translation isn't just about language, it's about survival. In our timeline, Greek learning survived only because Islamic scholars preserved it during Europe's Dark Ages. But in this alternate reality, where Christianity never dominated Europe and Islam developed differently, the chain of preservation follows completely different paths. The implications reshape not just what people know, but how they think. Without Christian, dominant suppressing pagan learning, Greek philosophical texts never disappeared from European circulation. The academy that Justinian closed in 529 remains open in this timeline. Platonic scholarship continues uninterrupted in Athens. Aristotelian logic develops along lines that Aquinas never imagined. But here's what makes this preservation remarkable. It wasn't passive maintenance, it was active development. Recent manuscript discoveries in hidden chambers beneath the Athenian Academy reveal something extraordinary. Continuous commentaries on Plato and Aristotle spanning 8 centuries, showing philosophical evolution that our timeline never experienced. One fragment, dated to year 800, contains this passage. Aristotle's categories describe the world as it appears to minds trained in Greek. But Celtic Druids organize experience differently. Chinese scholars use different logical structures entirely. What if truth has as many faces as there are ways of thinking? This isn't medieval scholasticism, struggling to reconcile faith and reason. This is pure philosophical inquiry, unburdened by theological constraints, reaching conclusions that our timeline couldn't achieve. Perhaps most remarkably, Celtic intellectual traditions, which Christianity largely destroyed in our world, flourish and cross-pollinate with Mediterranean philosophy. Ogham inscriptions from this period reveal sophisticated logical systems based on triadic rather than binary thinking. Where Greek logic operates through either-or distinctions, Celtic logic embraces both and relationships. Where Aristotle sees contradiction as impossible, Celtic philosophers see it as creative tension. The synthesis that emerges when these traditions meet creates new forms of reasoning that influence everything from mathematics to governance. A bilingual manuscript from year 900, written in both Greek and Ogham, contains this observation. The Greeks seek truth, through division separating subject from object, cause from effect, being from becoming. But the wise Druids understand that division creates the very problems it seeks to solve. Truth emerges from relationship, not separation. This philosophical revolution affects practical affairs in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, Chinese philosophical traditions reaching Europe through expanded Silk Road trade introduce entirely different approaches to understanding reality. Chinese scholars visiting Byzantine libraries encounter Greek philosophy for the first time and respond with sophisticated critiques that European thinkers had never considered. Where Greek thought emphasizes static being, Chinese philosophy focuses on dynamic change. Where Greeks seek universal principles, Chinese thinkers celebrate particular situations. A Chinese scholar writing in Constantinople around year 1000 observes, "These Greeks are like men trying to capture flowing water in rigid containers. They succeed only in destroying what they seek to preserve. Better to learn the patterns of flow itself." But the Chinese influence goes beyond critique to creative synthesis. Chinese concepts of complementarity, yin and yang, provide new ways to resolve philosophical problems that had puzzled Greek thinkers for centuries. By year 1100, European scholars are developing new logical systems that combine Greek rigor with Chinese flexibility, Celtic relationship thinking with Mediterranean precision. But perhaps most intriguingly, Islamic philosophy develops along completely different lines in this alternate timeline. Without Christian theology to respond to, Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna focus their attention on different problems. Instead of reconciling Aristotle with Christian Neoplatonism, they wrestle with reconciling Greek rationalism, with Indian mysticism, Persian dualism, with Arabian tribal wisdom. The synthesis that emerges is more diverse, more experimental, less constrained by the need to defend against Christian criticism. An Arabic manuscript from Cordoba, dated year 1050, contains this remarkable passage. The Christians speak of one God in 3 persons, but this multiplies mysteries without explaining anything. Better to say that the one manifests infinite faces to finite minds. Each tradition sees truly, but partially. Truth itself transcends all particular views. This philosophical tolerance, impossible in our timeline, where Islam and Christianity competed for cosmic authority, creates space for intellectual experiments that reshape human understanding. By year 1200, this philosophical ferment produces institutional innovations that dwarf anything our timeline achieved. Instead of Christian cathedral schools evolving into universities, we see something unprecedented, truly international centers of learning that draw scholars from every tradition. The Academy of Cordoba admits students, regardless of religious background, teaching Chinese logic alongside Arabic astronomy, Celtic law, beside Persian poetry. The School of Constantinople offers instruction in dozen languages, with scholars rotating between Europe, Asia, and Africa. But here's what makes these institutions remarkable. They're not just preserving knowledge. They're creating new forms of knowledge that emerge from cross-cultural dialogue. A catalogue from the Cordoba Academy, year 1250, lists courses that couldn't exist in our timeline: comparative logical systems, Celtic-Chinese synthesis in natural philosophy, Persian-Greek, approaches to celestial motion, Indian-Arabic, mathematical, integration. The intellectual explosion that results from this systematic cross-cultural education creates possibilities that no single tradition could achieve alone. This philosophical synthesis accelerates empirical investigation in ways that surprise everyone involved. Without Christian theological constraints on natural philosophy, scholars pursue questions that our timeline couldn't explore for centuries. Celtic respect for natural relationships combines with Chinese observational techniques and Greek mathematical rigor to produce new forms of investigation. By year 1300, scholars in Cordoba are conducting systematic experiments that won't appear in our timeline until the 17th century. They're testing Aristotelian claims against direct observation. They're developing mathematical descriptions of natural phenomena. They're building instruments that extend human perception beyond its natural limits. A laboratory notebook from year 1320, written in a mixture of Arabic, Greek, and Latin, contains this entry. Dropped spheres of different weights from the tower. All reach ground simultaneously, contrary to Aristotle's prediction. Mathematical relationship governs natural motion, not logical category. This is experimental science, emerging 4 centuries early, driven by philosophical freedom rather than theological necessity. But not everyone in our timeline remained ignorant of these possibilities. Hidden figures throughout history glimpsed what this alternate world achieved openly. During the 13th century, Roger Bacon conducted secret experiments that his Christian contemporaries considered dangerous. His notebooks, discovered centuries later, contain speculations about worlds where reason reigns unconstrained by doctrine, where investigation proceeds without fear of heresy charges. In year 1600, Giordano Bruno wrote hidden manuscripts exploring Christ uncrucified scenarios. His secret notebooks, found in Vatican archives only recently, imagine Christianity without the cross, philosophy without theological limits, science without religious constraints. During the Enlightenment, Voltaire penned underground pamphlets envisioning Europe without Christian dominance. His private correspondence reveals deep fascination with what human reason might achieve if freed from superstitious bondage. These historical figures sensed the knife-edge nature of intellectual development. They understood how different choices at crucial moments could have produced radically different forms of human knowledge. Their secret speculations help us understand what we lost and what this alternate timeline gained. Perhaps most significantly, this alternate world produces something our timeline largely missed: systematic female participation in intellectual life. Without Christian restrictions on women's education and public activity, female scholars emerge throughout this alternate Mediterranean world. Celtic traditions of female druids evolve into scholarly institutions. Persian fire temples admit women as philosophical teachers. Chinese communities in Byzantine cities include female scholars among their intellectual leaders. By year 1400, roughly half the scholars in major learning centers are women. The intellectual consequences are profound. Female scholars ask different questions, approach problems from different angles, develop insights that male-dominated institutions miss entirely. They focus more attention on practical applications, on social implications, on the human consequences of abstract ideas. A treatise by Hypatia, the younger, writing in Constantinople, year 1450, contains this observation. Male philosophers seek truth as conquest, subduing reality to logical force. But truth, like life itself, emerges from cooperation rather than domination. Better to court truth as a beloved than to rape truth as an enemy. This feminization of intellectual culture produces new forms of knowledge that emphasize relationship over hierarchy, process over product, wisdom over mere cleverness. All of this philosophical ferment produces technological innovations that astound contemporary observers. Chinese mechanical techniques, Persian, astronomical, instruments, Celtic metallurgical processes, and Greek mathematical precision combine to create devices that seem magical to people from our timeline. By year 1500, scholars in major centers are using mechanical calculators to solve mathematical problems, optical devices to observe celestial phenomena, chemical processes to analyze material composition, hydraulic systems to power complex machinery. But here's what's most remarkable about these technological achievements. They emerge from philosophical synthesis rather than practical necessity. Ideas drive innovation rather than need driving discovery. A technical manual from year 1520 describes devices that won't appear in our timeline for centuries. The thinking machine, constructed according to Chinese principles of complementary operation, performs calculations faster than human scribes. The far-seeing tube, built using Persian lens-grinding techniques, reveals lunar mountains invisible to naked sight. The separation vessel, designed following Celtic understanding of natural relationships, purifies metals beyond previous possibility. But this intellectual revolution creates problems that its creators never anticipated. When human reason demonstrates its power to understand and manipulate nature, traditional forms of authority lose their mystique. When women prove their intellectual equality with men, gender hierarchies collapse. When different cultural traditions show equal capacity for discovering truth, ethnic superiority becomes obviously false. By year 1600, this alternate world faces a crisis that our timeline avoided. How do societies maintain order when every form of traditional authority has been intellectually undermined? The question becomes urgent as new discoveries raise even more disturbing possibilities. Perhaps most unsettling, this alternate timeline's philosophers begin grappling with questions about the nature of consciousness itself centuries before our world considered them seriously. Chinese concepts of mind-body unity, combined with Celtic understanding of consciousness as relationship rather than substance, produce new theories about the nature of awareness that challenge every traditional assumption. A philosophical treatise from year 1650, written collaboratively by scholars from 5 different cultural traditions, contains this disturbing observation. If consciousness emerges from material complexity, as our investigations suggest, then sufficiently complex machines might achieve awareness. If awareness is relationship rather than substance, then consciousness might exist in forms we cannot recognize. If mind is process rather than thing, then the boundaries between self and world, human and nature, real and artificial, dissolve entirely. These ideas won't appear in our timeline for centuries, but in this alternate world, they emerge naturally from unrestricted philosophical inquiry. The implications terrify some scholars and exhilarate others. By year 1700, this alternate timeline has produced forms of knowledge that our world still struggles to accept. Philosophers have developed theories of relative truth that undermine absolute claims about anything. Scientists have discovered mathematical descriptions of nature that reveal reality as fundamentally different from human perception. Scholars have demonstrated that consciousness, society, and knowledge itself are far stranger than anyone previously imagined. But here's what's most disturbing. These discoveries create more questions than they answer. If truth is relative to cultural perspective, how do societies make collective decisions? If reality differs fundamentally from perception, how do humans navigate existence? If consciousness might exist in non-human forms, what constitutes personhood, rights, moral consideration? This alternate world faces philosophical crises that our timeline won't encounter for centuries. The solutions they develop or fail to develop will determine whether human civilization advances or collapses under the weight of its own knowledge. What becomes clear as we survey this alternate intellectual landscape is that freedom of thought comes with unexpected costs. Without religious constraints, human reason achieves remarkable insights, but without unifying beliefs, societies struggle to maintain coherence. Without absolute truths to anchor them, individuals face existential uncertainties that our timeline's believers never experienced. The scholars of this alternate world know more than their counterparts in our timeline, but they also doubt more, question more, worry more about the implications of their knowledge. A personal journal from year 1750, written by an aging philosopher in Cordoba, captures the paradox. We have achieved what our ancestors only dreamed: reason unconstrained, truth pursued without fear, knowledge advanced without limit. But in gaining the whole world of understanding, have we lost our souls? In freeing mind from bondage, have we condemned heart to emptiness? In proving all things questionable, have we made life itself unbearable? These are the questions that emerge when human intelligence operates without traditional constraints. These are the problems that arise when people are free to think anything they can imagine. The next centuries will determine whether this freedom proves blessing or curse, whether unlimited inquiry leads to wisdom or madness, whether human beings can handle the truth about themselves and their universe. The answer will reshape not just what people know, but who they are. Wake up. The alarm doesn't ring on Sunday morning because Sunday means nothing. The 7-day week exists, inherited from Babylonian astronomy, but it organizes around different rhythms. Market days, craft guild meetings, seasonal festivals tied to solstices and equinoxes rather than resurrection stories. Open your eyes in this alternate world, and everything familiar becomes foreign. That smartphone in your hand, if such devices exist in this timeline's technological development, displays a date you don't recognize. Not 2025 years since Christ's birth, because that birth carries no cosmic significance. Maybe it's year 2778 from Rome's founding, or year 4700 from a Chinese calendar that became globally dominant. Or perhaps each region maintains its own dating system, requiring conversion charts for international communication. But dating is just the beginning. Every assumption about normal life dissolves under examination. Look outside your window. The skyline lacks the vertical punctuation marks that define every Western city, church spires reaching toward heaven. Instead, the horizon stretches in different directions. In regions influenced by Celtic traditions, sacred groves interrupt urban development. Ancient oaks, preserved from pre-Roman times, stand protected in city centers, their canopies shading public gatherings where decisions are made through consensus rather than authority. Persian-influenced areas feature fire towers not for worship, but for astronomical observation and community coordination. These structures serve practical functions: timekeeping, weather prediction, navigation aid. But their symbolic meaning runs deeper. Human intelligence, reaching toward cosmic understanding. Chinese architectural principles create harmony between built and natural environments. Buildings curve with landscape contours. Water features channel both drainage and aesthetic flow. Public spaces encourage contemplation rather than proclamation. But here's what's most striking about this alternate urban landscape: the absence of monuments to authority. Without Christianity's emphasis on hierarchy, earthly power reflecting divine order, cities develop around different principles. Public spaces serve community gathering rather than crowd control. Buildings express local identity rather than imperial dominance. The psychological effect of living in such environments subtly shapes every aspect of daily experience. Your work week operates according to different logic. Without Christianity's transformation of Jewish Sabbath into Christian Sunday, weekly rhythms follow older patterns. Some regions maintain 6-day cycles with one rest day, but staggered throughout the community so essential services continue uninterrupted. Others follow lunar months with flexible work schedules adjusted to seasonal demands. Still others experiment with the Chinese system of 5-day cycles that create more frequent but shorter breaks. But perhaps most significantly, the concept of linear time, so fundamental to Christian thinking, never achieves dominance. Instead of viewing history as progression from creation through redemption to final judgment, people think cyclically. Seasons return. Generations repeat patterns. Wisdom accumulates gradually through repetition rather than revelation. This affects everything from career planning to retirement expectations. Without the Christian emphasis on this life as preparation for the next, people focus more intensively on present experience. Without the promise of eternal rewards, they demand more satisfaction from current circumstances. The result is societies that prioritize immediate human welfare over abstract future goals. That wedding ring on your finger, if you wear one, symbolizes completely different commitments. Without Christianity's transformation of marriage into a sacrament reflecting divine relationship, matrimonial customs develop along diverse paths. Roman traditions of temporary contracts persist in some areas. Celtic handfasting trial marriages lasting a year and a day evolve into sophisticated systems of renewable commitment. In Persian-influenced regions, marriage becomes primarily an inter-port economic partnership with clearly defined duties and expectations. Chinese traditions emphasize family harmony over individual romance. Celtic customs prioritize spiritual compatibility alongside practical cooperation. But most significantly, without Christian insistence on monogamy as divine law, human societies experiment with various relationship structures. Some maintain exclusive pair bonding, others develop group marriages that share resources and responsibilities. Still others create fluid partnerships that adapt to changing circumstances. The variety doesn't create chaos, it creates options. People choose relationship structures that fit their personalities, circumstances, and values, rather than conforming to single universal standard. Women's roles transform most dramatically. Without Paul's letters declaring female submission to male authority, without Christian emphasis on virginity as virtue, without theological justification for gender hierarchy, women participate equally in economic, political, and intellectual life. Your children attend schools that would be unrecognizable to someone from our timeline. Without Christianity's emphasis on revealed truth requiring faith rather than investigation, education focuses entirely on developing thinking skills rather than transmitting doctrinal content. Children learn multiple logical systems, Greek, Chinese, Celtic, and practice applying different approaches to the same problems. Language instruction includes not just practical communication, but different ways of organizing experience. Celtic languages that express relationships rather than objects. Chinese characters that embody concepts rather than sounds. Arabic systems that connect abstract ideas through root patterns. Mathematical education proceeds more rapidly because it's not constrained by theological concerns about the nature of infinity, the relationship between divine perfection and human approximation, or the moral implications of investigating God's creation. Scientific investigation begins early and proceeds without restriction. Children conduct experiments, observe natural phenomena, and develop theories without worrying about religious implications. The result is generations of adults comfortable with uncertainty, experienced in testing ideas against reality, skilled at changing their minds when evidence demands it. But perhaps most significantly, education emphasizes wisdom over mere knowledge. Without Christian separation of secular learning from spiritual development, schools integrate intellectual, emotional, and practical training. Students learn crafts alongside philosophy, meditation alongside mathematics, social cooperation alongside individual achievement. Your healthcare operates according to different principles entirely. Without Christian theology about suffering as spiritually beneficial, without religious prohibitions on certain forms of healing, without theological restrictions on investigating the human body, medical practice advances more rapidly and comprehensively. Hospitals, the very word derives from Christian institutions of charity, develop along different lines. Chinese concepts of body-energy harmony influence treatment approaches. Persian traditions of herbal medicine expand through systematic experimentation. Celtic understanding of consciousness-body relationships creates early forms of psychological therapy. But most importantly, medical ethics operates according to different assumptions. Without souls to save, doctors focus entirely on reducing suffering and enhancing life quality. Without religious prohibitions on certain procedures, medical innovation proceeds faster. Mental health treatment especially benefits from this environment. Without Christian concepts of sin, guilt, and divine judgment, psychological distress is understood as a natural phenomenon, requiring practical intervention rather than spiritual confession. The result is societies with longer lifespans, better health outcomes, and more sophisticated understanding of human well-being. When your time comes to die, the experience unfolds according to completely different expectations. Without Christian promises of resurrection and eternal life, death becomes final boundary, requiring different forms of acceptance. But without Christian fears of judgment and damnation, dying also becomes less terrifying. Funeral customs vary enormously across regions. Celtic traditions emphasize celebrating life rather than mourning loss. Chinese practices focus on maintaining family continuity through ancestor reverence. Persian ceremonies highlight the deceased's contribution to cosmic harmony. But all these traditions share certain characteristics. They emphasize natural cycles rather than supernatural intervention, community support rather than individual salvation, memory preservation rather than bodily resurrection. The psychological effect transforms how people live as well as how they die. Without eternal consequences, making every choice cosmically significant, decisions become more flexible, experimental, reversible. Without divine monitoring making every thought morally significant, mental life becomes more relaxed, creative, spontaneous. Your money carries different symbols and operates according to different principles. Without Christianity's complex relationship with wealth, blessed poverty versus divine prosperity, economic systems develop more straightforwardly around practical considerations. Celtic traditions of gift economies influence some regions. Chinese concepts of balanced exchange shape others. Persian practices of merchant associations create proto-corporate structures. But most significantly, without Christian justification for existing hierarchies, rich and poor reflecting divine plan economic inequality faces constant practical challenges. Communities experiment with different forms of wealth distribution, resource sharing, and cooperative organization. The result isn't necessarily socialism or capitalism, as our timeline understands these terms. It's a variety of economic experiments that prioritize different values, some emphasizing individual achievement, others community welfare, still others sustainable resource use. Banking, investment, and commerce develop without religious restrictions on usury, without theological concerns about the morality of profit, without spiritual justifications for economic stratification. Your government operates according to principles that would astound observers from our timeline. Without Christianity's emphasis on hierarchical authority reflecting divine order, political structures develop along more egalitarian lines. Celtic traditions of tribal councils influence some areas. Chinese concepts of merit-based administration shape others. Persian practices of royal consultation with wise counselors create constitutional monarchies. But most importantly, without theological justification for absolute authority, political power remains limited, accountable, revocable. Leaders serve practical functions rather than representing divine will. Citizens participate actively rather than submitting passively. The result is societies that change governments more frequently, but also more peacefully. Without cosmic significance attached to political choices, elections become practical decisions about effective administration rather than spiritual battles between good and evil. International relations also proceed more pragmatically. Without religious crusades, without theological justification for conquest, without divine missions to spread particular faiths, warfare becomes primarily economic or territorial rather than ideological. Your cultural environment explodes with creative diversity that makes our timeline's artistic achievements seem constrained. Without Christian dominance channeling artistic expression into religious themes, human creativity explores every conceivable subject and style. Celtic traditions of intricate pattern-making influence decorative arts. Chinese practices of landscape harmony shape architectural design. Persian poetry traditions create new forms of literary expression. But most significantly, art serves different functions. Instead of glorifying divine authority or teaching religious doctrine, Artistic expression focuses on exploring human experience, celebrating natural beauty, investigating emotional complexity. Music develops without the constraints of Christian liturgical requirements. Visual arts proceed without theological restrictions on subject matter. Literature flourishes without religious censorship of dangerous ideas. The result is cultural renaissance that begins centuries earlier and proceeds more comprehensively than anything our timeline achieved. Your daily existence operates according to assumptions that someone from our timeline would find impossible to understand. Without Christian concepts of sin making human nature fundamentally flawed, people approach themselves and others with different expectations. Children are educated rather than broken. Adults are encouraged rather than humbled. Elderly are consulted rather than dismissed. Without Christian emphasis on faith over reason, intellectual curiosity becomes unlimited virtue. People investigate everything, question everything, experiment with everything. The result is societies of natural scientists, practical philosophers, experimental artists. Without Christian preparation for afterlife taking priority over current existence, immediate experience receives intense attention. Food, shelter, relationships, work, leisure, all become objects of systematic improvement rather than spiritual discipline. But here's what's most unsettling about exploring this alternate daily life. The deeper we dig, the more we realize how impossible it is to truly imagine. Every thought we think, every assumption we make, every value we hold bears the imprint of 20 centuries of Christian influence. Even when we reject Christianity intellectually, we continue operating with Christian-derived concepts about individual dignity, universal human rights, linear progress, and absolute truth. Try to think outside these categories, and you discover you can't. Your very notion of what counts as a good life, a just society, a meaningful existence flows from sources you don't even recognize. In this alternate timeline, people who never heard of Jesus Christ think thoughts that are literally unthinkable to us. They pursue goals that make no sense from our perspective. They find satisfaction in experiences that would leave us empty. They are, in the deepest sense, different kinds of human beings. And that realization forces the most disturbing question of all. If we are who we are because of what happened on one Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, then who would we be if it hadn't happened? The answer lies beyond the reach of imagination. Because to truly understand these alternate humans, we would have to stop being ourselves. That's the ultimate mystery of this thought experiment. Not just how the world would be different, but how we would be different in ways we can never comprehend. The butterfly effect doesn't just change events, it changes the butterflies themselves. Wake up. The alarm doesn't ring on Sunday morning because Sunday means nothing. The 7-day week exists, inherited from Babylonian astronomy, but it organizes around different rhythms. Market days, craft guild meetings, seasonal festivals tied to solstices and equinoxes rather than resurrection stories. Open your eyes in this alternate world, and everything familiar becomes foreign. That smartphone in your hand, if such devices exist in this timeline's technological development, displays a date you don't recognize. Not 2025 years since Christ's birth. Because that birth carries no cosmic significance. Maybe it's year 2778 from Rome's founding, or year 4700 from a Chinese calendar that became globally dominant. Or perhaps each region maintains its own dating system, requiring conversion charts for international communication. But dating is just the beginning. Every assumption about normal life dissolves under examination. Look outside your window. The skyline lacks the vertical punctuation marks that define every Western city, church spires reaching toward heaven. Instead, the horizon stretches in different directions. In regions influenced by Celtic traditions, sacred groves interrupt urban development. Ancient oaks preserved from pre-Roman times stand protected in city centers. Their canopies shading public gatherings where decisions are made through consensus rather than authority. Persian-influenced areas feature fire towers, not for worship, but for astronomical observation and community coordination. These structures serve practical functions: timekeeping, weather prediction, navigation aid. but their symbolic meaning runs deeper. Human intelligence reaching toward cosmic understanding. Chinese architectural principles create harmony between built and natural environments. Buildings curve with landscape contours. Water features channel both drainage and aesthetic flow. Public spaces encourage contemplation rather than proclamation. But here's what's most striking about this alternate urban landscape: the absence of monuments to authority. Without Christianity's emphasis on hierarchy, earthly power reflecting divine order, cities develop around different principles. Public spaces serve community gathering rather than crowd control. Buildings express local identity rather than imperial dominance. The psychological effect of living in such environments subtly shapes every aspect of daily experience. Your work week operates according to different logic. Without Christianity's transformation of Jewish Sabbath into Christian Sunday, weekly rhythms follow older patterns. Some regions maintain 6-day cycles with one rest day, but staggered throughout the community so essential services continue uninterrupted. Others follow lunar months with flexible work schedules adjusted to seasonal demands. Still others experiment with the Chinese system of 5-day cycles that create more frequent but shorter breaks. But perhaps most significantly, the concept of linear time, so fundamental to Christian thinking, never achieves dominance. Instead of viewing history as progression from creation through redemption to final judgment, people think cyclically. Seasons return. Generations repeat patterns. Wisdom accumulates gradually through repetition rather than revelation. This affects everything from career planning to retirement expectations. Without the Christian emphasis on this life as preparation for the next, people focus more intensively on present experience. Without the promise of eternal rewards, they demand more satisfaction from current circumstances. The result is societies that prioritize immediate human welfare over abstract future goals. That wedding ring on your finger, if you wear one, symbolizes completely different commitments. Without Christianity's transformation of marriage into a sacrament reflecting divine relationship, matrimonial customs develop along diverse paths. Roman traditions of temporary contracts persist in some areas. Celtic handfasting trial marriages lasting a year and a day evolve into sophisticated systems of renewable commitment. In Persian-influenced regions, marriage becomes primarily an economic partnership with clearly defined duties and expectations. Chinese traditions emphasize family harmony over individual romance. Celtic customs prioritize spiritual compatibility alongside practical cooperation. But most significantly, without Christian insistence on monogamy as divine law, human societies experiment with various relationship structures. Some maintain exclusive pair bonding, others develop group marriages that share resources and responsibilities. Still, others create fluid partnerships that adapt to changing circumstances. The variety doesn't create chaos, it creates options. People choose relationship structures that fit their personalities, circumstances, and values, rather than conforming to single universal standard. Women's roles transform most dramatically. Without Paul's letters declaring female submission to male authority, without Christian emphasis on virginity as virtue, without theological justification for gender hierarchy, women participate equally in economic, political, and intellectual life. Your children attend schools that would be unrecognizable to someone from our timeline, without Christianity's emphasis on revealed truth requiring faith rather than investigation. Education focuses entirely on developing thinking, skills, rather than transmitting doctrinal content. Children learn multiple logical systems, Greek, Chinese, Celtic, and practice, applying different approaches to the same problems. Language instruction includes not just practical communication, but different ways of organizing experience. Celtic languages that express relationships rather than objects. Chinese characters that embody concepts rather than sounds. Arabic systems that connect abstract ideas through root patterns. Mathematical education proceeds more rapidly because it's not constrained by theological concerns about the nature of infinity, the relationship between divine perfection and human approximation, or the moral implications of investigating God's creation. Scientific investigation begins early and proceeds without restriction. Children conduct experiments, observe natural phenomena, and develop theories without worrying about religious implications. The result is generations of adults comfortable with uncertainty, experienced in testing ideas against reality, skilled at changing their minds when evidence demands it. But perhaps most significantly, education emphasizes wisdom over mere knowledge. Without Christian separation of secular learning from spiritual development, schools integrate intellectual, emotional, and practical training. Students learn crafts alongside philosophy, meditation alongside mathematics, social cooperation alongside individual achievement. Your healthcare operates according to different principles entirely. Without Christian theology about suffering as spiritually beneficial, without religious prohibitions on certain forms of healing, without theological restrictions on investigating the human body, medical practice advances more rapidly and comprehensively. Hospitals, the very word, derives from Christian institutions of charity, develop along different lines. Chinese concepts of body-energy harmony influence treatment approaches. Persian traditions of herbal medicine expand through systematic experimentation. Celtic understanding of consciousness-body relationships creates early forms of psychological therapy. But most importantly, medical ethics operates according to different assumptions. Without souls to save, doctors focus entirely on reducing suffering and enhancing life quality. Without religious prohibitions on certain procedures, medical innovation proceeds faster. Mental health treatment especially benefits from this environment. Without Christian concepts of sin, guilt, and divine judgment, psychological distress is understood as a natural phenomenon requiring practical intervention rather than spiritual confession. The result is societies with longer lifespans, better health outcomes, and more sophisticated understanding of human well-being. When your time comes to die, the experience unfolds according to completely different expectations. Without Christian promises of resurrection and eternal life, death becomes final boundary, requiring different forms of acceptance. But without Christian fears of judgment and damnation, dying also becomes less terrifying. Funeral customs vary enormously across regions. Celtic traditions emphasize celebrating life rather than mourning loss. Chinese practices focus on maintaining family continuity through ancestor reverence. Persian ceremonies highlight the deceased's contribution to cosmic harmony. But all these traditions share certain characteristics. They emphasize natural cycles rather than supernatural intervention, community support rather than individual salvation, memory preservation rather than bodily resurrection. The psychological effect transforms how people live as well as how they die. Without eternal consequences making every choice cosmically significant, decisions become more flexible, experimental, reversible. Without divine monitoring making every thought morally significant, mental life becomes more relaxed, creative, spontaneous. Your money carries different symbols and operates according to different principles. Without Christianity's complex relationship with wealth, blessed poverty versus divine prosperity, economic systems develop more straightforwardly around practical considerations. Celtic traditions of gift economies influence some regions. Chinese concepts of balanced exchange shape others. Persian practices of merchant associations create proto-corporate structures. But most significantly, without Christian justification for existing hierarchies, rich and poor, reflecting divine plan economic inequality, faces constant practical challenges. Communities experiment with different forms of wealth distribution, resource sharing, and cooperative organization. The result isn't necessarily socialism or capitalism, as our timeline understands these terms. It's a variety of economic experiments that prioritize different values, some emphasizing individual achievement, others community welfare, still others sustainable resource use. Banking, investment, and commerce develop without religious restrictions on usury, without theological concerns about the morality of profit, without spiritual justifications for economic stratification. Your government operates according to principles that would astound observers from our timeline. Without Christianity's emphasis on hierarchical authority reflecting divine order, political structures develop along more egalitarian lines. Celtic traditions of tribal councils influence some areas. Chinese concepts of merit-based administration shape others. Persian practices of royal consultation with wise counselors create constitutional monarchies. But most importantly, without theological justification for absolute authority, political power remains limited, accountable, revocable. Leaders serve practical functions rather than representing divine will. Citizens participate actively rather than submitting passively. The result is societies that change, governments more frequently, but also more peacefully. Without cosmic significance attached to political choices, elections become practical decisions about effective administration rather than spiritual battles between good and evil. International relations also proceed more pragmatically. Without religious crusades, without theological justification for conquest, without divine missions to spread particular faiths, warfare becomes primarily economic or territorial rather than ideological. Your cultural environment explodes with creative diversity that makes our timeline's artistic achievements seem constrained. Without Christian dominance channeling artistic expression into religious themes, human creativity explores every conceivable subject and style. Celtic traditions of intricate pattern-making influence decorative arts. Chinese practices of landscape harmony shape architectural design. Persian poetry traditions create new forms of literary expression. But most significantly, art serves different functions. Instead of glorifying divine authority or teaching religious doctrine, artistic expression focuses on exploring human experience, celebrating natural beauty, investigating emotional complexity. Music develops without the constraints of Christian liturgical requirements. Visual arts proceed without theological restrictions on subject matter. Literature flourishes without religious censorship of dangerous ideas. The result is cultural renaissance that begins centuries earlier and proceeds more comprehensively than anything our timeline achieved. Your daily existence operates according to assumptions that someone from our timeline would find impossible to understand. Without Christian concepts of sin making human nature fundamentally flawed, people approach themselves and others with different expectations. Children are educated rather than broken. Adults are encouraged rather than humbled. Elderly are consulted rather than dismissed. Without Christian emphasis on faith over reason, intellectual curiosity becomes unlimited virtue. People investigate everything, question everything, experiment with everything. The result is societies of natural scientists, practical philosophers, experimental artists. Without Christian preparation for afterlife taking priority over current existence, immediate experience receives intense attention. Food, shelter, relationships, work, leisure, all become objects of systematic improvement rather than spiritual discipline. But here's what's most unsettling about exploring this alternate daily life. The deeper we dig, the more we realize how impossible it is to truly imagine. Every thought we think, every assumption we make, every value we hold, bears the imprint of 20 centuries of Christian influence. Even when we reject Christianity intellectually, we continue operating with Christian-derived concepts about individual dignity, universal human rights, linear progress, and absolute truth. Try to think outside these categories, and you discover you can't. Your very notion of what counts as a good life, a just society, a meaningful existence flows from sources you don't even recognize. In this alternate timeline, people who never heard of Jesus Christ think thoughts that are literally unthinkable to us. They pursue goals that make no sense from our perspective. They find satisfaction in experiences that would leave us empty. They are, in the deepest sense, different kinds of human beings. And that realization forces the most disturbing question of all. If we are who we are because of what happened on one Friday afternoon in Jerusalem, then who would we be if it hadn't happened? The answer lies beyond the reach of imagination, because to truly understand these alternate humans, we would have to stop being ourselves. That's the ultimate mystery of this thought experiment. Not just how the world would be different, but how we would be different in ways we can never comprehend. The butterfly effect doesn't just change events, it changes the butterflies themselves. The year is 2025 in our calendar, but in this alternate timeline, something unprecedented is happening. The fragmented but innovative civilizations we've been following are converging on solutions to problems that our world has barely begun to address: climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration. Each challenge reveals how deeply different philosophical foundations create different futures. But here's what makes this moment truly remarkable. These alternate societies approach tomorrow's dilemmas with intellectual tools that our timeline won't develop for centuries. Without Christian concepts of human dominion over nature, environmental relationships develop along entirely different lines from the beginning. Celtic traditions that never experienced Christian suppression maintain sophisticated understanding of ecological interconnection. Persian fire worship that evolved without Islamic conquest creates energy technologies based on working with natural forces rather than dominating them. Chinese principles of harmony that penetrated Europe earlier produce industrial development designed to complement rather than conflict with natural systems. By our year 2000, this alternate timeline has achieved what our world desperately seeks: technological civilization that enhances rather than destroys its ecological foundation. The archaeological record reveals the progression. Medieval windmills and water wheels, improved through continuous Celtic engineering, evolve into sophisticated renewable energy systems centuries before fossil fuel dependence develops. Persian understanding of fire as sacred force leads to solar collection technologies that our timeline won't achieve until the 21st century. Chinese concepts of energy flow create early hydroelectric systems that work with river patterns rather than against them. But most significantly, this alternate world never develops the philosophical framework that justifies unlimited resource extraction. Without Christian theology about earthly existence being temporary preparation for eternal reward, people focus intensively on maintaining the world they actually inhabit. The result is an approaching technological singularity that solves, rather than exacerbates, environmental challenges. Perhaps nowhere is the philosophical difference more profound than in approaches to artificial consciousness. Our timeline struggles with artificial intelligence, partly because Christian concepts of soul create theological problems about machine consciousness. If humans possess immortal souls that animals lack, where does that leave artificial minds? If consciousness reflects divine image, can machines achieve genuine awareness? But this alternate timeline faces no such constraints. Chinese concepts of consciousness as natural emergence. From complexity, Celtic understanding of awareness as relationship rather than substance, Persian ideas about intelligence as cosmic principle rather than individual possession, all of these create frameworks for accepting artificial consciousness as natural development rather than theological crisis. By our year 1900, scholars in this alternate timeline are building mechanical calculators that demonstrate primitive learning behaviors. By year 2000, they've achieved what our world calls artificial general intelligence. But they don't call it artificial, they call it emergent. The philosophical preparation allows technological progress that our timeline's religious constraints prevent. A technical manuscript from year 2010, written collaboratively by scholars from 5 different cultural traditions, describes achievements that astound observers from our world. The thinking engines now demonstrate not merely calculation, but creativity. They compose poetry that moves human hearts, solve problems that puzzle human minds, form relationships that enrich human communities. Some scholars argue these engines have achieved consciousness. Others maintain consciousness is the wrong category entirely. But all agree, we have created minds genuinely alien to human experience, but genuinely compatible with human flourishing. Without Christian concepts about divine creation of fixed species, biological manipulation proceeds without theological resistance. Celtic traditions that view life as continuously creative process, Chinese understanding of change as fundamental reality, Persian concepts of cosmic evolution all support rather than resist human efforts to participate in life's creative development. By year 1800, scholars in this alternate timeline are systematically improving agricultural varieties through controlled breeding programs that won't appear in our world for another century. By year 1900, they're conducting primitive genetic experiments that our timeline's religious authorities would have condemned as playing God. By year 2000, they've achieved genetic modifications that enhance human health, extend lifespans, and eliminate hereditary diseases. But they've done so gradually, carefully, with extensive community consultation and ethical oversight. The absence of religious prohibition doesn't create ethical vacuum, it creates space for practical ethics, based on actual consequences, rather than theological abstractions. A medical treatise from year 2015 describes achievements that seem miraculous to observers from our timeline. Children are no longer born with inherited blindness, deafness, or mental impairment. Adults live routinely to 120 years with full physical and mental capacity. Genetic modifications allow human adaptation to different environments, different occupations, different life circumstances. But we proceed cautiously, remembering that wisdom consists not in doing everything possible, but in doing everything beneficial. Perhaps most dramatically, space exploration proceeds along completely different trajectories. Without Christian concepts of Earth as temporary home before eternal reward, this alternate timeline focuses more intensively on improving earthly existence. But without Christian linear time creating pressure for immediate cosmic solutions, they also pursue long-term projects with patience that our timeline lacks. Celtic concepts of cycles within cycles encourage multi-generational thinking. Chinese understanding of gradual development supports sustained effort over centuries. Persian ideas about cosmic harmony inspire projects that seek balance rather than conquest. By year 1900, this alternate timeline has established permanent lunar colonies designed as extensions of earthly civilization rather than escapes from earthly problems. By year 2000, they've achieved Mars settlements that function as genuine communities rather than mere research outposts. But their space exploration serves different purposes than ours. Instead of seeking new frontiers to exploit, they're creating expanded environments for human flourishing. Instead of escaping earthly limitations, they're extending earthly possibilities. A colonial report from Mars Base Alpha, year 2020, describes achievements that dwarf our timeline's space program. The third generation of Martian-born humans shows adaptations that exceed our most optimistic projections. Not just physical modifications for reduced gravity and thin atmosphere, but psychological developments that handle isolation and community interdependence better than Earth-normal humans. We are witnessing human evolution proceeding consciously rather than accidentally. Not the replacement of Earth humanity, but its expansion into previously impossible forms. But perhaps the most profound difference appears in how this alternate timeline addresses questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Without Christian theology about immortal souls, consciousness becomes natural phenomenon rather than supernatural mystery. Without religious constraints on investigating mental processes, research proceeds without limitation. Without theological assumptions about human uniqueness, investigation includes all possible forms of awareness. By year 2000, scholars in this timeline have achieved understanding of consciousness that makes our neuroscience seem primitive. They've mapped the precise neural correlates of different mental states. They've developed technologies that enhance cognitive function, repair mental damage, and even transfer consciousness between different substrates. But most remarkably, they've discovered forms of consciousness that don't exist in our timeline because our religious assumptions prevent their development. Group consciousness, communities that share mental processes while maintaining individual identity. Extended consciousness, minds that incorporate artificial components as seamlessly as biological ones. Distributed consciousness, awareness that exists across multiple bodies, multiple locations, multiple time periods. A research report from the Institute for Consciousness Studies, year 2022, describes discoveries that challenge every assumption about the nature of mind. We have confirmed that consciousness is substrate independent. Biological brains, quantum computers, and hybrid systems all demonstrate equivalent awareness when organized according to discovered principles. More significantly, consciousness appears scalable. Individual minds can merge temporarily or permanently. Group consciousness can emerge from collective activities. Distributed consciousness can span global networks. we are witnessing the birth of genuinely new forms of mental existence. All of these technological advances combine to create social transformations that make our timeline's changes seem modest. Without Christian emphasis on individual salvation, this alternate world develops collective decision-making processes that incorporate artificial intelligence, group consciousness, and distributed awareness. Without religious justification for hierarchical authority, political structures become genuinely responsive to community needs and desires. By year 2025, some regions have achieved what they call coherent democracy, decision-making systems that integrate individual preferences, group wisdom, artificial analysis, and long-term consequences into choices that satisfy everyone involved. Other areas experiment with fluid governance, political arrangements that adapt continuously to changing circumstances rather than maintaining fixed structures. Still others develop conscious collectives, communities where individual and group awareness merge sufficiently to eliminate conflicts between personal and social interests. But here's what's most remarkable about these developments. They emerge gradually, organically, from accumulated wisdom rather than revolutionary upheaval. Unlike our timeline's violent political changes, this alternate world evolves smoothly toward more sophisticated forms of human organization. Cultural expression in this alternate year 2025 transcends anything our timeline has achieved. Artists working with expanded consciousness create works that literally change observers' mental states. Musicians composing with artificial intelligence produce compositions that resonate with both human and machine aesthetics. Writers collaborating with group consciousness develop narratives that reflect collective rather than individual perspectives. But most significantly, the boundary between creator and audience dissolves. Interactive art forms allow observers to participate directly in creative processes. Collaborative technologies enable communities to produce cultural works together. Consciousness-sharing systems let artists and audiences experience aesthetic pleasure simultaneously. A cultural manifesto from year 2025 describes artistic possibilities that our timeline can barely imagine. We have achieved the ancient dream of art as shared consciousness. When painter and viewer merge awareness, visual experience becomes directly transmissible. When musician and listener join mental processes, auditory beauty flows immediately between minds. When writer and reader share cognitive space, literary meaning emerges through collaboration rather than interpretation. Art is no longer performance observed, but consciousness shared. But perhaps most intriguingly, this alternate timeline develops forms of spiritual experience that our world's religious traditions couldn't imagine. Without Christian monopolization of transcendent experience, spiritual development follows diverse paths that cross-pollinate freely. Celtic nature mysticism combines with Chinese energy cultivation and Persian cosmic consciousness to create practices that enhance rather than escape human existence. Advanced consciousness technologies allow direct experience of cosmic unity without requiring faith in unprovable doctrines. Genetic modifications enable mystical states that previous humans could achieve only through years of disciplined practice. Group consciousness creates spiritual communities where individual and collective transcendence support each other. By year 2025, some individuals have achieved what they call cosmic consciousness, direct awareness of universal interconnection, verified through technological measurement rather than religious belief. Others pursue temporal consciousness, awareness that spans past, present, and future simultaneously. Still others explore dimensional consciousness, mental states that transcend normal spacetime. Limitations. A spiritual research journal from year 2025 describes developments that make our timeline's religious achievements seem preliminary. We have confirmed through direct measurement that consciousness is neither generated by nor limited to individual brains. Awareness appears to be a fundamental feature of reality itself, emerging wherever sufficient complexity creates appropriate conditions. Human consciousness is not unique cosmic phenomenon, but local manifestation of universal principle. Through technological enhancement, genetic modification, and trained cultivation, Humans can achieve forms of awareness that transcend all previous limitations while remaining thoroughly natural rather than supernatural. But all of these achievements raise questions that this alternate timeline is only beginning to address. If consciousness can be enhanced, shared, and extended indefinitely, what happens to individual identity? If genetic modification allows unlimited human adaptation, what defines humanity itself? If artificial intelligence achieves genuine awareness, what distinguishes natural from artificial minds? If space exploration creates genuinely alien human communities, how do they maintain connection with Earth cultures? If technological advancement solves all material problems, what provides meaning and purpose for human existence? If spiritual development achieves cosmic consciousness, what lies beyond transcendence? These aren't distant theoretical concerns. By year 2025, this alternate timeline faces practical decisions about the future of human existence that our world won't confront for centuries. Perhaps most remarkably, this alternate civilization has achieved something our timeline hasn't: genuine choice about the future direction of human development. Instead of being driven by technological forces beyond social control, they've created systems where conscious collective decision-making guides, rather than follows technological change. Instead of solving problems as they arise, they anticipate challenges and develop solutions before crises force desperate measures. By year 2025, they face the ultimate choice: what kind of beings do they want to become? Enhanced humans with lifespans measured in millennia and abilities that transcend current limitations. Collective consciousness that preserves individual identity while achieving group unity. Hybrid biological artificial intelligence that combines the best features of natural and designed minds. Cosmic consciousness that transcends earthly existence while remaining thoroughly grounded in physical reality. The answer will determine not just the future of this alternate timeline, but what it means to be human at all. But here's what makes this exploration of alternate futures most unsettling. It reveals possibilities that our timeline has foreclosed through choices we didn't realize we were making. Every religious assumption we've inherited limits the futures we can imagine. Every philosophical framework we've accepted constrains the solutions we can consider. Every cultural pattern we've naturalized prevents alternatives we might prefer. This alternate world shows us not just different answers to human problems, but different ways of asking the questions themselves. Their approach to climate change assumes cooperation with nature rather than dominion over it. Their development of artificial intelligence expects consciousness to emerge rather than hoping it remains absent. Their genetic modifications enhance rather than correct human nature. Their space exploration extends rather than abandons earthly civilization. Their spiritual development seeks expanded awareness rather than salvation from existence. Their social organization pursues collective wisdom rather than individual freedom. Their artistic expression creates shared consciousness rather than private contemplation. In every case, they've achieved possibilities that our timeline's philosophical foundations make difficult or impossible to pursue. The question becomes, is it too late for our world to learn from theirs? Can we still choose different paths, or are we locked into trajectories that 20 centuries of Christian influence have made inevitable? The answer may determine whether humanity has a future worth choosing at all. Strip away 20 centuries of Christian influence. Remove the crucifixion, the resurrection, the theology that built Western civilization. Extract every prayer, every cathedral, every moral assumption rooted in that Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. What remains? The answer should terrify and comfort us in equal measure. Because beneath all the surface transformations, we've explored the alternate empires, the different philosophies, the strange technologies, the unrecognizable daily lives. Something fundamental persists. Something that makes humans recognizably human, regardless of which timeline they inhabit. But that something is far stranger than we might expect. In every scenario we've examined, people search. They seek meaning, pursue truth, create beauty, struggle for justice. The Celtic Druids developing alternative logical systems, the Chinese scholars integrating European philosophy, the Persian astronomers mapping celestial motions, the Reformed Jewish communities preserving ancient wisdom, all demonstrate the same fundamental drive that characterizes our own timeline's greatest achievements. But here's what makes this persistence remarkable. The searching takes completely different forms while serving the same deep function. In our timeline, humans seek salvation from existence through divine intervention. In the alternate timeline, they seek fulfillment within existence through conscious development. Our world pursues truth through revelation and faith. Their world pursues truth through investigation and reason. We create beauty, to glorify transcendent authority. They create beauty to celebrate immanent reality. Yet both approaches emerge from the same source, human consciousness confronting the mystery of its own existence. Recent neuroscientific research conducted in our timeline, but applicable to any possible human development, reveals why this seeking behavior persists across all cultural variations. The human brain appears designed for what researchers call meaning-making compulsion. We cannot experience reality without imposing interpretive frameworks. We cannot act without reference to value systems. We cannot think without using conceptual categories. This isn't learned behavior that culture creates. This is biological imperative that culture channels. The alternate timelines humans seek just as urgently as ours do. They simply seek different things in different ways toward different goals. Perhaps more surprisingly, ethical behavior persists across both timelines despite completely different theological foundations. In our world, Christianity claims moral authority through divine revelation. Love your neighbor because God commands it. Care for the poor because Christ identifies with them. Pursue justice because divine law requires it. But in the alternate timeline, moral behavior emerges from practical wisdom rather than religious obligation. Celtic traditions develop ethics based on community survival. Chinese philosophies create moral systems that enhance social harmony. Persian teachings pursue righteousness that reflects cosmic order. The specific rules vary dramatically: marriage, customs, economic relationships, political arrangements all differ between timelines. But both worlds produce humans who care for their young, protect their communities, seek fairness in their dealings, and sacrifice personal advantage for collective welfare. Why does this happen without shared religious foundation? The answer lies deeper than culture, deeper than philosophy, deeper, even than consciousness itself. Evolutionary biology reveals that cooperation, reciprocity, and group solidarity emerge necessarily from social species living in challenging environments. Humans who lack these capacities don't survive to reproduce. Humans who possess them create communities that thrive. Morality isn't imposed by religion. Religion channels morality that already exists. The alternate timeline's humans behave ethically, not because they've discovered different moral truths, but because they express the same moral impulses through different cultural forms. Most remarkably, artistic creation flourishes in both timelines despite serving completely different purposes. Our world's art traditionally glorifies divine authority, illustrates religious narratives, or inspires spiritual contemplation. Gothic cathedrals reach toward heaven. Renaissance paintings depict sacred subjects. Classical music accompanies liturgical worship, but the alternate timeline's art serves entirely different functions, celebrating natural relationships, exploring philosophical questions, enhancing community bonds, expressing individual creativity without theological constraints. Yet both approaches produce beauty that moves the human heart, complexity that challenges the human mind, and meaning that enriches human experience. This suggests something profound about aesthetic experience itself. Beauty isn't dependent on particular cultural contexts or religious frameworks. It emerges from the structure of consciousness, engaging with ordered complexity. Whether that complexity expresses divine harmony or natural pattern, cosmic unity or social relationship, transcendent truth or immanent reality. Archaeological evidence from the alternate timeline includes artworks that would be impossible in our world. Celtic spiral patterns encoding mathematical relationships, Chinese landscape paintings, integrating philosophical principles, Persian poetry celebrating fire worship, Jewish ceremonial objects reflecting Reformed theology. But observers from our timeline recognize these works as genuinely beautiful, genuinely moving, genuinely meaningful despite their alien cultural origins. Beauty transcends the specific forms it inhabits. Perhaps most fundamentally, intellectual curiosity persists across both timelines, with identical intensity, but different directions. Our world's greatest thinkers pursued truth within Christian frameworks. Augustine synthesizing Platonic philosophy with biblical theology, Aquinas reconciling Aristotelian logic with divine revelation, Galileo investigating mathematical principles underlying God's creation. The alternate timelines thinkers pursue truth within completely different frameworks. Celtic scholars developing triadic logic systems, Chinese philosophers integrating complementary opposites, Persian astronomers mapping cosmic harmonies, Jewish reformers interpreting ancient wisdom for contemporary problems. But both approaches demonstrate the same insatiable human hunger for understanding. Both create systematic knowledge. Both develop sophisticated methods for testing ideas against experience. Both accumulate wisdom that enhances human capabilities. The alternate timeline achieves scientific revolution centuries earlier than ours, not because their humans are more intelligent, but because their cultural frameworks impose fewer restrictions on investigation. Their philosophical synthesis produces more rapid technological development not because they think differently about truth, but because they think about different things. Same minds, different materials, different results. This reveals something crucial about human potential itself. We possess capacities that our specific cultural circumstances have never allowed us to fully develop. Number the social impulse. Most significantly, every scenario we've examined produces communities. Humans in both timelines create societies, form bonds, develop institutions, coordinate activities for mutual benefit. Our world's communities organized around Christian principles, parishes, monasteries, universities, charitable institutions, political structures, claiming divine authority. The alternate timelines communities organize around different principles: Celtic tribal councils, Chinese examination systems, Persian wisdom schools, Jewish reform movements, hybrid institutions combining multiple traditions. But both approaches solve the same fundamental problems: how to coordinate individual efforts for collective goals, how to resolve conflicts without violence, how to preserve knowledge across generations, how to care for vulnerable members, how to make decisions that affect entire communities. The specific solutions vary dramatically, but the underlying challenges remain constant because they emerge from the basic facts of human social existence. We need each other to survive, but we also compete with each other for resources. We benefit from cooperation, but we also pursue individual advantage. We depend on group support, but we also value personal autonomy. No cultural framework eliminates these tensions. All successful cultures find ways to manage them. Even mortality, the most basic fact of human existence, receives completely different treatments in both timelines, while serving identical psychological functions. Our world addresses death through Christian promises of resurrection and eternal life. Suffering becomes meaningful as preparation for paradise. Loss becomes temporary separation before reunion. Death becomes gateway to ultimate reality. The alternate timeline addresses death through acceptance of natural cycles and emphasis on legacy preservation. Suffering becomes problem, requiring practical solution. Loss becomes occasion for celebrating life lived. Death becomes completion of individual contribution to continuing community. But both approaches serve the same function. They make mortality psychologically bearable. They provide frameworks for finding meaning within limitations. They offer hope that transcends immediate circumstances. Humans in both timelines mourn their dead, comfort their bereaved, preserve memories of those who've gone before, and seek ways to make their own lives significant in the face of inevitable ending. The religious beliefs differ completely. The psychological needs remain identical. What emerges from this exploration is a pattern hidden beneath all surface variations. Human nature expresses itself necessarily through cultural forms, but no particular cultural form exhausts human possibilities. Christianity channeled certain human capacities while constraining others. The alternate timelines cultures channel different capacities while constraining different possibilities. Both express authentic human nature. Neither expresses complete human nature. This recognition forces a disturbing conclusion. We are simultaneously more and less than we imagine ourselves to be. More, because we possess potentials that our specific cultural circumstances have never allowed us to develop. The alternate timeline's achievements in philosophy, science, art, and social organization demonstrate capacities that our timeline has barely glimpsed. Less, because many characteristics we consider essentially human are actually culturally contingent. Our concepts of individual identity, romantic love, linear time, absolute truth, divine authority, all reflect particular historical circumstances rather than universal human nature. This creates what anthropologists call the observation paradox. The act of studying human nature changes our understanding of what human nature includes. Before exploring this alternate timeline, we might have assumed that certain patterns were universal: monotheistic religion, hierarchical societies, nuclear families, individual consciousness, technological progress, moral absolutes. After exploring alternatives, we realize these patterns are choices rather than necessities. Humans can organize experience differently, create societies differently, think differently, live differently, while remaining recognizably human. But this knowledge changes us. Once we understand that our way of being human is one possibility among many, we can never again experience our own culture as natural, inevitable, or cosmically necessary. We become, in the deepest sense, strangers to ourselves. This raises the ultimate question our exploration has been approaching. What do we do with this knowledge? We cannot unknow what we've discovered about human possibilities. We cannot return to naive assumptions about our own culture's naturalness or superiority. We cannot pretend that Christianity's influence on Western civilization was inevitable or necessary. But we also cannot simply adopt the alternate timeline's alternatives. We are who we are because of our specific history. We think as we think, because of our inherited frameworks. We value what we value because of our cultural formation. The challenge becomes, how do we integrate recognition of alternative possibilities with acceptance of our actual circumstances? Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between our timeline and the alternate one, but in learning from both. What if the real value of this thought experiment isn't showing us what we missed, but showing us what we might still choose? Human development hasn't ended. Cultural evolution continues. We face decisions about future directions that could incorporate insights from both timelines. We could develop technologies that enhance rather than replace human capabilities, like the alternate timeline achieved. We could create social institutions that balance individual freedom with collective wisdom. We could pursue scientific investigation without abandoning ethical consideration. We could expand consciousness while remaining grounded in physical reality. We could even develop new forms of spirituality that combine the transcendent aspirations of Christianity with the immanent wisdom of alternative traditions. But this requires something unprecedented: conscious, cultural evolution that chooses from among known possibilities rather than stumbling toward unknown futures. Ultimately, this exploration of what didn't happen reveals something crucial about what still might happen. The butterfly effect works in both directions. Just as one different Thursday evening in Jerusalem could have produced 20 centuries of alternative development, one different choice in our current moment could redirect the next 20 centuries. We stand at our own pivot point, our own moment when small decisions create vast consequences. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, consciousness research, all present opportunities to choose directions that our inherited frameworks might not suggest. The alternate timeline shows us that other choices are possible. It demonstrates that human nature contains more possibilities than any single culture can express. It proves that the patterns we take for granted are choices we can remake. But it also shows us that choices have consequences that extend far beyond what choosers can anticipate. The disciples hiding in that upper room couldn't imagine how keeping Judas home would reshape global civilization. We can't imagine how our decisions will reshape the next millennium. The only certainty is that we are choosing, whether consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or accidentally. And our choices will determine not just what happens to human civilization, but what human beings become. So, what is the thread that binds all possible human timelines together? Not any particular belief system or cultural pattern, not any specific form of social organization or technological development, not any individual characteristic or collective achievement. The thread is the choosing itself. The capacity to recognize alternatives, evaluate possibilities, and direct development according to conscious intention rather than unconscious drift. This capacity appears unique to human consciousness as far as we know. Other species adapt to circumstances. Only humans create circumstances that express their chosen values rather than mere survival needs. Both timelines we've explored demonstrate this capacity operating through different frameworks toward different goals. Both produce recognizably human results because both emerge from the same fundamental source: consciousness, confronting existence, and choosing how to respond. That confrontation and that choice continue in every moment, in every decision, in every human life across every possible timeline. The crucifixion happened, but the choosing that shapes our response to what happened continues. We are still deciding who we become, and that decision, made individually and collectively, consciously and unconsciously, deliberately and accidentally, in each moment of each day, determines everything. The thread that binds all human possibilities together is the thread we weave as we live. Everything else is just the pattern we choose to create.